Welcome to Bold Voices, Good Yarns. I'm your host, Ian Henzel. Behind every book lies an author's life story. So join me on an interactive journey as we step between the pages to explore how an author's life and their experiences have shaped the stories that we cherish and love. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, and join me as we step between the pages. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ian Henzel, and I'm the host here at Bold Voices, Good Yarns. We're going to be talking to a poet and author today, Gregg Shapiro. So make sure you grab a cup of joe or your favorite cocktail, get yourself cozy, because we're going to be stepping between the pages of Gregg Shapiro's life. Welcome, Gregg.
Don't get a paper cut.
I want to thank you for being on our show today.
I want to thank you for inviting me.
So, what this podcast does is we look at authors' lives, and you're an author and a poet. So do you consider yourself a poet and an author, or an author and a poet?
Well, since I make my living as an entertainment journalist, I consider myself an entertainment journalist who also writes poetry and short fiction.
Okay. All right. Entertainment journalist. That must be interesting. You must get to meet lots of interesting people.
It's the best job I've ever had. It's the hardest I've ever worked, and I've never made less money in my life. So it's great.
Well, welcome to the We Do It for the Love of Doing It club.
Sure, that sounds good.
So let's jump into your life. Can you share a bit about your upbringing and how that influenced your worldview?
I'll try. Yeah. My parents were very young. I was born and raised in Chicago. My parents were very young when I was born. My father was 21. My mother was 19. I always said, I was in no hurry to be here. They could have waited, but they chose not to. So, that I think having young parents and sort of growing up with my parents, if that makes sense, I think that certainly had an influence on my worldview. I'm the oldest of three. I have a brother who is 3.5 years younger than I am, and I have a sister who's 9.5 years younger than I am. So for those first 3 years, I was an only child, and I still behave like an only child. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where that comes from. And so I was born in Chicago and then raised in a suburb just north of Chicago. And I was, a lot of times people say they move out of a city to improve their lives. I mean, they certainly could have stayed there, and I don't think it would have been that much different. I knew I was gay at a really early age, so I feel like that didn't fit in well with the suburban life that I was faced with my classmates, etc.
Well, what happened? What were the moments in either your childhood or your young adulthood that you think were pivotal in inspiring you to write? And again, you're unique. Our guests have either been involved in the book industry or they're authors, but you're a journalist, a poet, and an author. So
Yes.
what inspired you to write?
So I was a voracious reader because that was, what gay boys who were hiding from bullies did. They locked themselves in their bedroom and read and masturbated, sometimes both. So I was kind of locked away doing that. So I read a lot. And then I also watched a lot of movies, more movies than TV. Went to the movies a lot and listened to music in a huge way. Like music was essential. And so I think that all of those influences, all of those arts influenced me as a writer. Like I think about Joni Mitchell or Laura Nyro, like two of my favorites, or Leonard Cohen, really great lyricists. And then I love comedy. And so I think about Woody Allen or Mel Brooks or some other people. So yeah, I don't know. I hope that's a good answer. And then of course, other writers. I mean, one of the books that I always cite and I was a teenager when I read it, was Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. I read that, and then Larry Kramer's Faggots also came out in the
It
same
came out
year.
around the same time,
Yeah.
like around 1979, 80.
I
My
think
memory's
early, like
fuzzy on it.
77, 77, 8. So those
Yeah, and
books,
they were, and Dancer from the Dance, the big thing was it was the first literary
that's
gay
right.
novel,
That's right.
but they
So
came out
those,
simultaneously, yeah.
yeah, those were big influences. I mean, I've been reading everything. I'm one of those people who I wasn't reading like Tolkien, and I wasn't, or sci-fi. That was just, I needed like the closest thing to other people's real lives as possible. And I wouldn't find that in fantasy. Like I wasn't a comic book reader or any of that stuff. I needed like guidance. So
Well, it's interesting. You say, you knew you were gay, you felt you didn't fit in. So there was that escape into books and music and film. And, I wonder sometimes, and I did that, quite honestly. I was an avid reader. I listened to music. I was probably a 7-year-old musical theater queen, you know. So so it's all those things, and I wonder, and we're gentlemen of a certain age, before some things were more accepted, and I wondered if people really fit into that escapist mold, or where they tried to fit in and pretend that they were just like I didn't, just like you didn't.
but I did. I mean, I also, when I was able to do stuff that I liked, I did theater in high school, and then actually started college as a theater major, that's a whole separate show. That story. But so I sort of found my people there also.
Hmm.
The we didn't have GSAs when I was in high school, but we had the theater department, which was the closest thing to that.
What's a GSA? I'm sorry, I'm
Gay
showing my
Straight
ignorance.
Alliance, which they have, well,
Okay,
they
okay,
have in a lot
yeah.
of high schools. They have them not so much in high schools here in Florida anymore, but they still exist in high schools in like real states.
We didn't have them, but I graduated high school in 1976. So, it didn't exist when I went to college. They had
Sure.
them. And I think it's harder for younger people to understand
Mm, yeah,
that there wasn't all the support structures. You had to find it, you had to create it.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
And it was rather challenging.
Yes, I graduated a semester early from high school because I felt like my life was in danger. And so
Well,
I
dare
needed,
dare dare I say, back then nobody cared about how you felt or how we felt.
oh,
It
yeah,
wasn't
right.
like today where
Right. But I was well aware that it was not safe for me to be at school. There was a lot of bullying.
and it was also a period of it was a period of time where, oh, you were expected to just suck it up and put up with the bullying.
Right. Right. But as it turns out now, thanks to Facebook, I am actually friends with some of those people who have evolved over time. That's good.
You're kinder than I am, Greg.
No one has ever described me as kind, but that's nice. Thank you.
Well, you're more generous than I am, shall we say.
Okay.
Were there any authors or writers that were profound influences on you?
Well, as I mentioned, Andrew Holleran. I did go through a phase. In fact, I've talked to your husband about this author, and this was probably what I would qualify as like the strangest fiction I read was the work of Richard Brautigan, who wrote.
Yeah, yeah, I've read Richard Brautigan.
Yes, that was as far as I could go. Yeah, I didn't emulate him, but I read all of his books. I love Trout Fishing in America and The Hawkline Monster and all of that. I just was obsessed, but it was just I just liked what he wrote. And actually, you and I have talked previously about the amazing Danny Dunn series of books. Is that a bad subject?
Yes, yes.
That,
No, no, no. You could bring up Danny Dunn because the last question is going to be, if you could live in a book, what book would you live in? And nobody, it is still a relatively young podcast. Nobody's ever asked me. And what inspired me with that question is I read the entire, and for the viewers, listeners who don't know Danny Dunn, Danny Dunn was a series kind of like the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew, but much nerdier. Danny Dunn had his friends.
Yes.
And he was what I thought of was cute at the time in the illustrations with his curly hair and his turtlenecks, but they were science-based adventures. They knew a professor, and there was Danny Dunn and the homework machine,
Homework
Danny
machine,
Dunn
of course.
and the anti-gravity paint. And I avidly read them, and I wanted to be in those books.
See, this
And
is
you're the first person I know that has read that series.
well, this is also where the books meet my other love, which is music, because there was actually, if I could find it somewhere, there was an LP of Danny Dunn and the Homework Machine, the musical. It was like kids, they wrote songs. And if I could sing, I would sing one of them. And I had it for years and I don't know where it is, but I would love to find. So that was like, okay, I like this book series. And then, oh my God, here's like a musical version of it. So unintentionally gay. I mean, I don't think they planned it that way, but just so gay.
Well, do you think, well, obviously it was escapism, and you're the first person that I know that's read the series that as a kid, and I didn't fit in. I really didn't fit in. Childhood was not a happy time for me as well. But, when I would pick up a book, I could disappear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go on an adventure.
I was reading a lot of like horror too, like when The Exorcist came out, Thomas Tryon, I believe was gay, who wrote The Other and Harvest Home. I was reading a lot of that stuff. Early Stephen King. I kind of stopped Stephen King maybe after 4 or 5 books. But again, that to me was escape, also because a lot of times the bad guys eventually got it in the end. Like people were terrorized and then the bad guys got it.
We talk about our lives having a fairy tale ending.
Yeah.
So we use it as part of our speech. So let me ask you this, since we're talking about Danny Dunn and we're talking about living in books. If you could live in a book, what book would you choose to live in?
It's again, I think I keep going back to Dancer from the Dance because it was a world. I was really young and I was so fascinated by it. I mean, it was, I was like in a Chicago suburb, and this is New York and Fire Island, and there was all of this stuff going on. Now, that's to say that by that time, I was already exploring that Chicago's version of that. Like I was already going out into bars underage, with friends, high school friends, and then college friends. And so, and while it didn't necessarily compare, I mean, it didn't come close, I don't think, to what New York was. It was exciting. So I was like reading about it. And then I sort of got to like, again, in a very small way, sort of experience it. I mean, I certainly wasn't as pretty as the characters in those books. I had a mirror. I knew what I looked like. So, but it was exciting to like observe what was going on.
It was in a way an attractive or an alluring world.
Yeah.
And often when we think about living in a book, it's not necessarily being one of the main characters,
Right.
but being part of
Yes.
what's going on in the
Observing,
world of the
close.
book.
Yes.
And observing. And you do a lot of observation. You have a collection of short stories, How to Whistle, and there's an expanded edition. And the cover of that is on the screen where I can kind of see from what you're saying how that sensibility made its way into your short stories.
Well, observation, and I think the other thing that is really important to me, both in my short fiction and in my poetry, is place. I think that is essential to me. And being lucky enough to have lived in Chicago and Boston and Washington, D.C., and now South Florida, I get really inspired by where I am or where I've been. Like if I'm working on something. I could be setting something in DC, although I haven't lived there in a number of years, but it's still really vivid to me. And I go back to these places all the time, so I'm watching them change. So place is also observation, but also place is.
Well, I think of your short story, If Jesus Came to Skokie. And for listeners who don't know, Skokie is I don't know if it still is, a very Jewish suburb of Chicago. And I know there was a scene in there where Jesus is riding on the bus. I forget the number of the bus, but
The number 97 bus. It was the idea was just that the story actually was originally a poem that had been published. And then I went back to it and I felt there was more meat to it and turned it into a short story. And it was really about growing up. It takes place in the 1960s when I lived very close to a high school as a kid. And so there were all these like hippies and lots of like beards and long hair, and everybody kind of looked like Jesus. And just the fact that it's very, this imagining if Jesus had been there. And so that was the concept.
So that's How to Whistle, and there's a new expanded edition. And again, the cover is on the screen for you to see. Well, Gregg, I do have a thought, I'm thinking you mentioned the Danny Dunn the musical. I wonder if there's potential for an all gay version of Danny Dunn and the musical.
It could be Danny Got Done.
Danny Got Done. Well, I had the hots for Danny Dunn. I know.
I get it. I'll go on Amazon and eBay and see if I can find any of those the musical album.
Well, you said when you were young, you spent time in the bedroom reading and masturbating. I guess it was quite a Danny Dunn adventure.
That's right. I done myself. Yes, exactly.
Well, Gregg, I want to thank you for being on Bold Voices, Good Yarns. It's been delightful. I hope we can have you on the show again. And
I'd love to come back.
We look forward to seeing you again soon. And everyone, please be sure to subscribe and follow us. You can find our channel on YouTube. We're on SoundCloud, Spotify. We're in all the gin joints all over the place. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you again soon with another, as we step between the pages of another interesting life. Thanks, Gregg.
Thanks, Ian.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Bold Voices, Good Yarns, brought to you by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on social media. Search for Rattling Good Yarns Press. Also, visit our website at rattlinggoodyarns.com, where you can find great reads and interesting articles about the world of books. See you soon!